So when I do these presentations, I normally never spoke about myself and who I am, but I would get so many questions about who you are and why you're doing this that I'm going to very briefly run over that. So about 2009 or 2008 sometime, I was giving a little talk at a science week at a school, and I saw this poster in the back of the class. So I went to have a quick read. I didn't know much about nuclear energy. I do have a degree which covered some undergrad physics and so on, so I understand it, but I'm not an expert. And this looked a bit suspicious to me. You can see the advantages were quite extensive and the disadvantages were quite small. And I'm going to ask you all to guess what the disadvantage, the single disadvantage that appeared on this poster about nuclear power was. 100,000 of these were printed and distributed for free to schools in South Africa in 2009. It was funded, obviously, by the nuclear industry. And this kind of deceptive practice, to be fair, is not unique to the nuclear industry. Big Tobacco denied the cancer story, genetic modifications, and so on and so on. So have you had time? Can you take a wild guess to yourself what the one single disadvantage of nuclear power is? Yeah, the only disadvantage is people don't like it because they're stupid and they're uninformed. And this made me very, very angry. And it basically had the opposite effect to what it was intended to. And it turned me into an anti-nuclear activist. So I was in between jobs and I gave up 6 months of my life to various activist things. This was at the International Convention Center in Cape Town. There was a green fair. That ended up me going to COP17 in Durban and organizing some stuff in the street and with some cooperative people who liked what I'm saying. I've done a lot of workshops at grassroots level, as you can see. That ended up with me being invited to Japan and visiting the Fukushima area. That's the 20-kilometer exclusion zone. That's equipment that was outside every school at that time. That inspired me to come back and run a conference in 2012 for a global, what was it, Africa Free Nuclear Power for Africa sort of conference. Had about 5 or 6 international attendees, which was quite interesting. I then got invited to Sweden and I visited the nuclear regulator there and I saw how they dealt with their waste process. That's how their low-level waste is disposed of in Sweden, 400 meters under the granite. This is how it's disposed of in South Africa, 4 meters under the clay. Then I got appointed to the board of the nuclear regulator in South Africa as the person representing the interests of communities, which is required. That made international news when I was fired almost immediately by Minister Mantashe. And then I took him to court and I won the court case against him, but the position remained vacant. So nobody was on the board representing communities from 2022, and that's still the case now. Although it's required by law,
no representatives.
There's nobody on the board in that position. All right. So enough about me. Let's go on to what we're actually talking about. What we're talking about is the scoping phase, and only the scoping phase at this stage. And I thought I would very briefly explain that in the form of a diagram. So we start at the top left where we have the applicant. And in this case, the applicant is Eskom. Eskom describes the project and gives a whole lot of money to a consultant. And those consultants are called environmental assessment practitioners, or EAPs for short. And in this case, the EAP is WISP. WSP is the company that is doing it. Coincidentally, also does a lot of consulting work in terms of building nuclear plants. Would you believe it? Their job at this stage is to produce what's called a draft scope report, and that's the report that you might have seen. And they must send that report out to the public and to the decision authority, which could be local or provincial or national. In this case, it's the National Department of Fisheries, Forestries and the Environment, or let's just say the Department for the Environment. And they will then give comments. The public give comments or submissions back to the EAP, and the EAP then produces a final scoping report. So the final scoping report is a description of the project, obviously. It's the key environmental issues that have been identified that need to be studied further, a summary of the public participation submissions that have made, which alternatives were considered and will be considered, and the plan for the detailed environmental impact assessment, or EIA, and that leads to something called the EIR, which is the Environmental Impact Report, and that is the output of the whole EIA process. So I hope that's not too overwhelming or complicated, but as a quick analogy, just so this point is quite clear, I want to paint a hypothetical picture where you're working at a company and your manager says they want to buy a new mahogany desk for themselves. And you think this is a ridiculous idea, but there is a board meeting of the directors coming up, and you want to make sure this issue is discussed at that board meeting and the manager does not buy the mahogany desk. So when you have a meeting like that, the first step is to set an agenda, and whatever's on the agenda is discussed, and whatever's not on the agenda will not be discussed. So you need to write an email to the secretary of the board or whatever and say you would like this subject to be on the agenda. Now, you've got two ways of doing that. You could write and say, mahogany desks are ridiculous. My manager wastes a lot of money. She's arrogant and she's just trying to be show off. And I think it's a stupid idea and I want to discuss it at the meeting. That would be one way of going about it. Another way of going about it would be to write an email saying, I think the issue of expenditure on office furniture is something that there could be some savings on, and I'd like that discussed at the board meeting. So I'll leave it to you to decide which of those two approaches are more likely to get the subject onto the agenda, because initially your only aim is to get the matter to be discussed at that board meeting. So these are some uncomfortable truths to get out of the way right at the beginning. This EIA process will not be stopped at the scoping phase, even if there's overwhelming objections from the local public. That's not how it works. And to go back to the analogy about a agenda, the board meeting won't be cancelled because people object to the agenda. The board meeting will go ahead. The EIA is going to go ahead. What you can affect at this stage is the scope, what will be discussed at that meeting. Next uncomfortable truth is that national priorities are more important than local objections. And I'm going to be talking a bit later about trying to see this from a bird's eye perspective and even from the other side's perspective, because only by doing that can you really be effective in making a submission or more effective in making a submission. Next point is that government has proposed a nuclear industrialization plan. I put a link there below. And in May 25, recently in Parliament, they said they want to go for 10,000 megawatts of nuclear in South Africa, or 10 gigawatts. It's 5.2 gigawatts that they've raised the maximum at Thyspunt. So that tells you two things. Firstly, it's not only one site. Secondly, an industrialization plan doesn't make sense for a single plant. So the government's plan is not to build a plant and be finished with it. It's to build a nuclear industry in this country. And that implies the next point. It's not a question of here or there. It's a question of all three sites that have been identified, Bantamsklip, Danafontein, and Thyspunt, or nowhere. And that leads to the next point, that asking them to build it somewhere else first is shooting yourself in the foot, because because it simply builds momentum of the whole industrialization plan. And then once that ball starts to roll, it rolls faster and faster. Also, it's a little problematic in building solidarity. If you say to the people at Bantamsklip, hey, let's collaborate and let's put our heads together. But by the way, we're asking Eskom to go build it in your backyard. That's going to have a certain effect on solidarity. Then Eskom already owns the land at Thyspunt, and I just put a dot there because you can draw your own conclusions. Another truth, there are moles and informants in your WhatsApp group. This is inevitable. It happens all the time. So bear that in mind when you're discussing strategy. There are people on your group who are informing Eskom and others about what you're saying. And maybe even here, maybe in this group, there's someone like that. You've always got to be aware of that, which means when you're talking strategy, when you're talking high level, make sure it's people you know personally, people you have a connection with, people you trust, people hopefully you can meet in person. And then finally, there will be paid community members to spread pro-nuclear messages. And I think someone posted on the group an example of that already happening. We must make sure this thing comes here because it'll be good for us and so on. So Now I want to start talking about the technicalities of submissions. And one thing that I've learned from being on the inside is what leads to multiple submissions being considered a single submission. And there's often a summary that's given to the board at a high level or to the minister, and it says we've had 1,000 objections, submissions, five, five of them are in favor, three of them are against, eight of them are, whatever. And just note something, by the way, I refer to them as submissions, not as objections. And we'll come to that as I go through. So if you say, as you write your submission, I'm a member of an organization, I'm a member of Thyspunt Alliance, and 1,000 people write in saying that, that's considered one submission because you are submitting as that organization and you're lumped together in that organization. So the takeaway from that is if you're going to write a submission, don't say you're a member of this organization, say you're writing in your own capacity. Obviously, those organizations will also put together hopefully very substantive submissions as well. But when you do your own, don't identify yourself as part of that organization. Any submission that looks like a copy paste is considered one submission. So if you distribute, here's an example of what your submission could be, and 1,000 people copy and paste it and email it in, they'll consider that one submission. Then I've just put a reference here to templates, and this is slightly hazier, but it's something to be cautious about when you distribute templates. When you say, here's something you can fill in for your own submission, if you're not careful, that can look a little bit like copy and paste, but that does depend on the detail of what is in the template and what is not. And then finally, people have often had the idea of aggregator websites where you go to a little form online and you fill in your reason and you press post and it automatically sends an email off. Be cautious about that because those are also often lumped together as that website sending in a single submission. So now when it comes to the content of submission, and a lot of what I'm doing is going to be asking questions in this short presentation, which isn't going to be much longer. Here you put yourself in the position of a national minister and you've got to weigh up different things. So on the one side, on the left-hand side is somebody who says, my holiday home will lose value. The Cape St. Francis town character is going to change if this goes ahead. There'll be negative effects on the local environment. Those are important points. Then on the other side, we look at millions in South Africa live in energy poverty. Load shedding, when it happened, cost the economy billions, from which the economy will never recover because we were put years behind. And energy security is a national priority. So if you were a national minister, which side of the scale would be weightier in your mind? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. When any communication happens, and typically in marketing, we talk about a target audience. So you've got to think, who are you talking to when you write your submission? Is it monolithic evil? That's obviously slightly tongue-in-cheek, but that is how I started. I viewed everybody who's trying to build nuclear as one solid monolithic entity. They all agree with each other. They all want to build nuclear. They're all hell-bent on it, and none of them have any self-doubts. If that's who you're talking to and you think you're talking to, then you phrase things a certain way, and you would attack that monolithic evil. Option two, are we talking to, say, the ESCOM chief nuclear officer? Are we saying nuclear is bad and you shouldn't actually get the promotion you're going to get when there are 3 nuclear plants? You should go find a job in another field. If that's your target, then that will shape your message. Number 3, are we maybe talking to an anti-nuclear official who's in the department but is bound by their performance agreement that says they have to implement government policy? So, but they are a bit anti-nuclear. Now they need material. They need to go to their colleagues and say, here's something that's been submitted. Don't you think this seems reasonable? We need to consider this factor. So if you're talking to that person, you would phrase things in a certain way. Are you talking to the corrupt official? Because obviously all of these things exist to a degree. The official who's been paid off to say, make this nuclear go through, it'll be worth your while. I'll put your child through private school. I'll buy you a car, whatever. Are you going to write to that official and say, give back that bribe, don't go ahead? If you are, you would phrase it a certain way. Then there are people who are just pro-nuclear. They think it's fantastic. They've been taken in by some sort of information, or it's their belief. Are you trying to talk to them and say, don't be a pro-nuclear person? Or are you talking to the fence sitter, that person who says there seems to be pluses, there seems to be minuses, I don't really know where I stand? Is that the person you're talking to? So once you've decided that in your submission, you start thinking, what is the most effective mechanism or tone of your communication? Should you shout at the person? Should you be abusive and insult them? Is sarcasm a good communication technique? Should you write in and say, my mind is made up, this is a stupid idea, and here's the reasons? Or should you be impartial and reasonable and say, well, while I understand the need for energy, I think some of these factors really should be studied in detail before a final decision is made. And you match those different styles against who you think your target audience is, who you're talking to, who your audience is. Hopefully that makes sense. So I want now to have a slightly interactive session, and the heading here says that you've got to have counterpoints. You've got to understand what the opponent's view is. So the people who want to build a nuclear plant, what do they want? So I'd like you to be brave and to open this up to the floor and to have someone step forward and say, somebody says it's going to create a lot of jobs. What counter do we give? And if we can just jump to the bottom and for the moment say, all of this is for now in the context of the draft scoping report. So can somebody from the floor say, how would you counter the it will create jobs story? I know it's hard to be brave and be the first to speak.
Yeah, I'll
but
give
give
it a
it.
go.
Okay.
Sure,
Go
it will definitely create jobs, but these will be majority skilled labor, which does not exist in huge quantity in our area.
Okay, good. Anyone else? That's good. We'll keep the others for maybe the next point. So,
Yeah, Peter, I could say just that the cost per job is going to would be enormous. There must be more
Right.
cost-effective ways of creating jobs.
Okay, good. Now, those are very...
Sorry,
Yes?
Peter. One important thing is Eskom has already appointed the Kucha Industrial Zone to manage the recruitment of labor,
Yeah.
which is ridiculous. So they talk about local jobs. It's not even going to come to St. Francis to manage the labor. They've already given and signed an agreement with Kucha Industrial Zone, and they will create jobs for their connections and whatever. So,
Okay. All right, fantastic. So let me give a little bit of feedback on those. And those are totally valid points. And those come into the whole EIA process. But bear in mind, we are at the scoping phase. So, for example, one thing that you might write as a submission is the actual, while we understand it will create jobs, we believe that a careful study of the cost per job should be included in the environmental impact study. So by phrasing it like that, you're not in a way showing your hand. You're not saying, I'm against this. I think I've already come to a prejudgment. I've already decided it's a bad idea and the jobs are not valid. You simply are providing material to that reasonable official, to that fence sitter official to say, this is a good point. We must make sure that the assessment studies the cost per job, and then it comes to a conclusion. To have some of the other things, the highly skilled. So what you could say for that is, while I understand that job creation is a priority, I believe that there should be a careful assessment to see how many of those jobs could be actually local and how many would have to be sourced elsewhere because of the skills thing. From the COHA point of view, one could also have a very similar response, and all of them could also maybe come at another angle. And this is where the concept of widening the scope comes in, where you would say, are those permanent jobs or are they temporary jobs? And in your mind, you would say, well, they're probably going to be temporary jobs, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, I believe that the scope of this study should include the socio-economic impacts of migrant labor on the local economy and social fabric from a sociological point of view. And that then would encourage or hopefully force the scope to include a study on that. And if an independent academic does a study on that, we hope that they will come to the conclusions that the three of you have already come to in your mind. Does that make sense?
Yep, good point.
So, and we can carry on with this discussion. Just now we're going to get to Q&A, but let's try the next statement. It's going to solve the climate crisis. Any responses to that? What would your submission be at this point? And note again, I'm using the word submission as opposed to objection. Anyone? I can sort of make something up if no one wants to step forward.
I would suggest perhaps looking at alternative ways of mitigating the climate crisis through wind and solar, and suggesting careful cost analysis needs to be done to compare those various options.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So I also expected someone to talk about the speed, because climate is a crisis, and you don't respond to a crisis with a plan to have something ready in 15 or 20 years' time. You respond to a crisis more quickly than that. So my emotional impulse is to shout at them and say, it's not fast enough, it's stupid, there are better ways of doing it, everybody knows. But a more reasoned approach is precisely what you've said, is that I believe there should be a careful analysis if this is the most effective, cost-effective and timiest way to address climate crisis, and there should be a specialist study comparing this solution to other solutions for climate crisis. So great response the way you put it. Next one, and I'm sure you're starting to see the pattern now. It's going to provide security of supply. Any responses to that?
Yeah, I think it's the same. It's the same argument. Maybe in 15 years' time, but what about now?
Yeah, same argument. So again, one tries to find a way to phrase that as, oh, I haven't reached any conclusions. I'm not a professor of, security of supply networks, but I believe that this should be studied carefully to see if it is the most effective way of security of supply. And at that point, one can also perhaps refer to studies. And the DBSA study, the Development Bank of South Africa, was a 3-year study done in conjunction with the President's Climate Commission, the Development Bank of South Africa, and another important government organization that I've forgotten. Was it the CSIR? I'm not sure. Who did the study and said for a secure supply and meeting all the climate goals, the emission goals, there's no need for nuclear. So one can say in one submission that, although security of supply is very important and the impacts of load shedding are terrible, I believe that this impact assessment should include a detailed study of alternative ways of providing security of supply, and a reference is the government commission study. And here's the reference, which, you just drop that in, that it must include, that as a reference. So the same thing is, I don't think we need to go over it. The same one. It's going to provide cheap electricity. Oh, maybe this is a bit more nuanced, actually. It will provide cheap electricity, and the IRP 25 has already said that we need nuclear. So we're going ahead for nuclear. What would be the counterpoint to that? And this is a complex one.
I think there's quite a few points against this one, but I would initially just start by requesting maybe some evidence of a study of nuclear versus renewables. And maybe understanding what the background is to why nuclear was actually included in the IRP, considering how fast technology has moved over time.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing as well is, prove that it will supply cheap electricity. So you need some kind of comparative study on old technologies versus new technologies. It can even be new nuclear, the smaller little nuclear systems. But you can't just say that. They need to show exactly how that would happen, and because I don't think that is true at all.
Yeah. Again, very well put. And what they're going to try and do is say, well, the IRP has already decided it, so we don't need to study it. And what a good submission would be at this point is that never mind what other government studies have come up with, this is an EIA, and this needs to have a section on alternatives as is required by the regulations. So a detailed study must be done without just bowing to another government study that came out. And by the way, the IRP has been deeply criticized, and it also didn't release its modeling. So in other words, it didn't show what the assumptions and how they arrived at the costing. They did a very hand-wavy thing where they said, nuclear is a little bit more expensive than the others, but it sort of pays itself back over time because of the industrialization plan and so on. So exactly as you said there, that this EIA needs to do an independent, thorough analysis of the costing. So you've really...
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask, so from what I understand, the IRP did not initially include nuclear. That was amended because of a political decision, not because of a scientific or a proper study that was done. It was purely political.
Yeah, and very interesting how Minister Ramaphosa said, we're going to separate politics from nuclear. Nuclear's failed in the past because it's political. And then in the same speech, he said, and politically, nuclear is more in favor in Europe than it is now. So they want it both ways. And as you correctly point out, the IRP in what's called the least cost scenario, where they look at how to achieve energy security at the least cost, did not include nuclear, but there's someone called yes, a scowling face, exactly, Meryl. There's something called a policy adjusted IRP, where they say, yeah, that's what the experts said, but our policy is we're going to go nuclear, so that's the end of it, we're going nuclear. So yeah, so those are all good points. What else was I going to say about that? Yeah, and so that is a political decision, and that has no place in a scientific assessment of alternatives. So that, I think, is another way of undermining this thing about we deferring to the IRP because it's government policy and that's the end. It's not good enough when you're doing an independent assessment to say some other government body made a decision, so we're going to bow to that and to just to carry on. Then I've made a few notes at the bottom here, and you mentioned the costing, and full life cycle costing is something that's quite typically asked for and quite typically ignored in nuclear. So where will the waste be disposed of? What exactly is the cost of disposing of the waste? And why can that be excluded from this study? And there's a sort of informal legal term called slicing the salami, and I call it slicing the cheesecake. So if you're on a diet and you can't really have cheesecake, but if you cut a very small slice of it, it's okay, it gets by. But then if you've cut one very small slice, just afterwards, you can cut another very small slice, and then it also doesn't count. And you can end up eating the whole cheesecake, which that wouldn't be allowed by your diet policy. So it's the same here, that by saying, waste disposal is for another EIA later, we're just going to produce the waste now, and then we're going to study what the impact of disposing of the waste later is a suspect thing. So that could also be worked into a submission at this point to say that such a costing analysis must include the full life cycle cradle to grave of this process. And there's no acceptable excuse to say we're going to hand the hot potato to another department and they're going to dispose of the waste and they're going to find the money. It's not our problem. And there's also a technique here called discounting to zero, and anyone with an accounting background will understand what I mean. They say, we only have to dispose of the waste in 60 years' time, and because the future present value of money calculation, that's worth nothing at all. Delia, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi Peter, it's Anthony. Yeah, so this waste issue, in the scoping report, they mentioned that it's going to go to the the Nuclear Waste Institute that they've developed, or the exact name I can't remember. But on their website, they only deal with intermediate level waste, and the high level waste, they basically are saying, well, we're going to do that in the future. We don't have a plan. That says coming now. So in the scoping thing, how should we, should we point out that it doesn't, that there's a fault in the scoping thing there, that they just say that those people will do with it and deal with it, and that they don't, on their website, they don't have a plan for it? Or how would we raise that? Because I mean, this is a big hole with nuclear, is that they have a neat plan for the low and intermediate level waste, but nothing for the high level waste. And they so do we say that they need to have an expert deal with how they're going to come up with a response to that in the EIA?
Yeah, good question. So at the moment, there is an EIA happening at Thyspunt, and the organization you're trying to think of is pronounced NORWARDI, which is the National Radioactive Waste Disposal Institute, NRWDI, and they took over the Thyspunt site, which is in Namakwaland. And I actually visited Namakwaland at a request of some farmers there, and we met and we discussed the whole issue. So that's an example of slicing the cheesecake, because they're doing one EIA down here and they're doing another EIA for that process. But part of an EIA must always be what's called a no-go option. No-go, N-O-G-O, meaning what happens if you don't do this project? What's the consequence of doing that? Now, when you slice the salami and you allow the plant to produce waste, and you say later we'll do an EIA what to do with the waste, the problem is you've undermined the process, because there's no such thing as a no-go option. Because you can't say, let's not produce the waste. It's already been done. So it's forcing the hand of the secondary EIA by passing the first EIA. So there's a good argument to be made that an EIA should include all the impacts, and that includes the transport of waste, whether there are the final steam generators are radioactive, the reactor cores, they're going to have to be transported. I think they need 150-ton trucks. Are the bridges able to take that? What's the cost going to be of upgrading that road, or will the waste just stay in Thyspunt forever? That must be studied as part of the report as an integrated thing. And there are maybe people who are more familiar with the regs, or I could look them up, that there is something written about that there has to be an integrated report. It has to integrate all aspects of the project. You're not allowed to simply slice it. So coming back to how you phrase that for this submission is a respectful, reasonable way of saying, due to the fact that these are unknown, you would submit that the study, specialist study, must include a costing of all the processes of disposing of the waste to a final repository. Okay, so what next? What to do? I just wrote this recently. Your anger is a resource. Spend it wisely. So don't spend it fighting with each other. Don't spend it fighting with people who are trying to help you. That would delight Eskom if that all was done that way. It's a great resource, people's anger, and channel it now. So the point now is to widen the scope. And we've got another, I think, 7 days left. Do we need a follow-up session? I'm available to do that if you want to. Maybe you've given this a bit of thought and we want to swap some ideas around. I think it's time to mobilize. So reach out to other communities. Have a look at your demographics. Are you all wealthy? Are you all of a certain ethnic group? If so, that's a problem, because it's going to be seen as coming from a certain demographic. Channel your resources effectively. So everyone has limited time and limited energy. So if people are unable to write a submission and it's too much for them, push them to. Let them submit, give money, and then they feel they've done something. Let people do what they are effective at doing. At this stage, prepare for the assessment. We know that we just now are neutral, and we're just going to say we think that the scope should include this, but we need to prepare for the next phase where you are going to be saying, I disagree, this is wrong, etc., etc. From my experience, I find it very useful to build a list of experts. I'll come to the raised hands now. Build a list of experts. Do you have a marine biologist? Do you have a lawyer? Do you have this? Look at those specialist studies, keep a spreadsheet of them, and say these people are going to study this. Also, bear in mind, volunteers drop out. Life happens, things happen. Don't rely on a single person. Every time you've got one person looking at something, make a team. Have somebody seconding them so that their work is not lost if they have to drop out for some reason. And also honor everyone's contribution. You know, volunteers are very touchy people, like herding cats. So whatever someone contributes, they need to be shown appreciation for that, and to honor what they've done and to build on that. And then I said, what else? What else have I missed? So let me hand over to the people who have raised hands. Meryl?
I just wanted to know if they could throw objections out that were generated via AI.
How would they know is my question. And it would come back to that previous slide that I put in, which said if they're similar, you know, if they look the same, if you've put on the group, here's a submission you guys can make, and people say, fantastic, I don't have time, I'm going to copy and paste that in, that'll be seen as a single submission. But that they've used AI, I don't see how they can really discount that.
Okay.
But you have brought up two other points, and that is, and I read in the chat as well, somebody said, can you submit after the date? Often you can, but they do have a good case for saying, sorry, we had to do a cutoff and we were so reasonable, we gave you an extension, which is their tactic they always do, by the way. They give you a ridiculously short time, and then everyone complains, and 3 days before the deadline, they say, okay, we'll give you another month. And then they can look like they've been so reasonable when it comes later. Look how long we gave them, but meantime, you've all been messed around because you've rushed, you've done a submission, and now you've got more time. Now what do you do? So that brings me to another point, is you quite are entitled to say, oh, we got an extension. I want to withdraw my previous submission, and here's my new submission. And it's their job and their problem that the amount of admin that caused, because they didn't give the reasonable deadline in the first place. So that is possible to do. I wouldn't risk at this point being late on it, because they could say, you know, we had so many submissions, we had to. But realistically, with the date, what's it, the 25th of May? On the 25th of May, it's not like they've read every submission. That's when they start the process. So they could very easily process a submission that comes on the 27th. So if something really bad happens, you might well get considered, and you write to them and say, please condone my late submission. I ask that you take it into account anyway, and here it is. And there's quite a bit of precedent legally that if they seem to be unreasonable, like they say by midnight on the 25th, and you send it at 1 a.m. the next morning, and they try and say, well, we're ignoring your point, if that comes to court in the end, the judge is going to look at that and say, well, that wasn't really reasonable, you know? So that gives a bit of background, but the summary is try and do it by the date. But they're probably going to allow it if it's the next day and so on. Oh, thank you for your attention. This is a few photographs from Japan. May this never happen here. That's me in the top right, standing at the 20-kilometer exclusion zone around Minnesota, the Fukushima place. That's a fireman in the top left who was separated from his wife and child because for safety reasons they had to move away from the radiation, but he couldn't afford to travel more than twice a month to visit his newborn child. He's 20-something. He heard people screaming and dying after that. On the bottom left is how children arrive at school every day after the Fukushima disaster. And the bottom right is a business that is outside the 20K zone, but right on it. And obviously it went out of business because it lost half of its customers. And that reminds me, my very first slide, I wanted to do a diagram of the 16-kilometer circle around Thyspunt, but it was a bit big. And you can see that it takes most of it. So that's the official evacuation zone around it. In Japan, in fact, there was a mandatory evacuation zone of 20 kilometers.